Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar, Integrating Effective Communications and Technology Strategies for Severe Weather Crises. This event, brought to you by Security Magazine, is sponsored by Everbridge. I'm your moderator, Maria Henriquez, Associate Editor at Security Magazine. Thank you for joining us. Today's presenters are Michelle Cousins, Business Strategist at Plan B Consulting, and Matt Schmid, Senior Product Marketing Manager at Everbridge. Don't forget to submit your questions, and later in the program, our presenters will address as many as possible. Today's event is being recorded and archived on securitymagazine.com. And now I am excited to turn it over to today's presenters, Michelle and Matt.
Well, thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. I'm here in Chicago, and I have to tell you that if you haven't heard, we had quite a series of tornado-related events even last night. And while we didn't actually have tornadoes touch down, we had significant wind damage, and the sirens were going off for quite a while. It's interesting because we often sort of joke about the weather, but we really aren't joking about it too much these days. I do want to thank Everbridge for including me in today's discussion because I do really work with a lot of both HR managers, safety and security personnel, and other planners where we start to really look at this issue. And so today we'll talk about various aspects of this. Imagine that, really this is not sort of just an afterthought anymore. Since 2019, there's been a 40% increase in the damage that's been caused by weather-related events. And really, just in terms of the insurable losses, that has been more than $80 billion. And so if we've learned anything from this, we're seeing more extreme weather. We're seeing even more damage and less predictability. And so today I'm going to talk about some ways that we can mitigate some of these effects and hopefully help our operations to recover even faster. So some of the topics I'll talk about here include the predictions and what we see in terms of the forecast. I'll also delineate between weather and climate in that. And also some best practices in terms of what we can do communication-wise when something like this occurs. And then also, of course, technology can really be hugely helpful in this. And so even the smallest of companies today are able to really incorporate technology to their advantage. So let's start off by talking about some of these predictions. I know that sometimes we think about that quote, everybody talks about the weather, but nobody does anything about it. But these days we can't afford to just take that approach. So I give some resources here on this slide that may be helpful to you, but just to kind of, paint the picture, we're seeing that based on weather.com and some of these other resources that the summer of 2022 is expected to be hotter than the average. And of course, those of us, especially in the Midwest right now, I know today we're supposed to have a feel like temperature of over 100 again tomorrow. So it's definitely resonating. But certainly across the country, a lot of challenges. There's an expansive area from the Great Basin and the Rockies to the Plains, the Midwest, interior Northeast, that's forecast to see temperatures that are really most above average from June all the way through August. Now, that means that meanwhile, while we may see some muted effects relative to the average in the Southeast and Gulf Coast, we certainly have other weather patterns that I'll be discussing there as well. But forecasts are really trending also towards what they call a rare triple dip, or a third consecutive La Nina this fall and winter. So 5 of the past 6 summers preceding La Nina winters have been hot overall in the U.S. And so various extended forecast models are also showing that it's going to be hotter than usual in the north, below average heat in the south, but there's an expansive drought from the plains to the west that may also influence the summer temperatures. And of course, this is something that we need to just make sure that we continue to monitor. So I'm giving you a snapshot of what they know today, but obviously, as you know, the weather can change, right? So even beyond these more general forecasts, the volatility of day-to-day weather has been increasing significantly as well. So let me talk a little bit about the difference between climate and weather, because sometimes people interchange those terms and they don't really necessarily mean exactly the same thing. So climate is more measured in decades, whereas weather is in hours or days. And so that's why I say, even though I gave you sort of some predictions, the farther out we go, the less reliable those predictions become. When we think about climate, though, climate can be regional, it can be global, whereas weather is typically local. And the climate is the average of weather. And that average has been changing very significantly, setting new records in various aspects across all kinds of different areas of the world. So climate change is really driving the more extreme weather. And even I think some of the holdouts on this have started to realize this is a reality. So warmer weather as well as colder weather is happening. We're seeing more polar extremes in terms of the two ends of that. Record heat waves, record cold snaps. We definitely are seeing more flooding and more droughts. Areas are getting wetter. Hotter areas are getting hotter. The drier areas are getting drier. We're seeing a lot more heavier rainfall. Some of the storms that we experience are at a heightened level, so they're nastier and they're more what we call superstorms. And certainly we're seeing stronger tornadoes that are not necessarily occurring in the same places that they used to be as well. So a lot of changes in where things occur as well. When we think about global climate change impacts, we can think about things like the intensification of the water cycle. So there's more intense rainfall and associated flooding that's occurring as a result of this. And then the flip side is that the droughts where those occur, those are much more intense. The changes in rainfall patterns, we're seeing that in the high latitudes, the precipitation is likely to increase. And meanwhile, it's projected to decrease over large parts of the subtropics, which of course is problematic because they need that rainfall. That means that we're also seeing changes in monsoon precipitations too. There's a continued sea level rise. We talk about what that means for all of our coasts. So more frequent and severe coastal erosion and flooding that can occur. We're seeing more of these 1 in 100-year type of sea level events happening more frequently. As far as further warming, we are seeing that amplifying permafrost thawing. There's a loss of seasonal snow cover itself. And so you're seeing that all of a sudden they're sort of like the tipping of the apple cart, right? That some of these things that were slow to happen are now causing much faster and more dramatic changes. So melting of glaciers and ice sheets, the loss of summer Arctic sea ice, and then changes to the ocean. So we've got, more frequent marine heat waves and ocean acidification, reduced oxygen levels that are affecting the ecosystems both above the water and below the water. And then there are aspects of climate change for certain cities that get further amplified. So when you live in an urban setting, or you work in an urban setting, heat gets contained, it gets concentrated. And so that means it further accentuates some of these effects. And then of course, flooding from heavy precipitation, for those coastal type cities, that is being even more detrimental than ever before, of course. So let's talk about what we can do about all of this. So the first step is, obviously be really aware of what's going on, keep an ear to the ground and that kind of thing. But then also we want to think about what we can actually do. And so looking at the types of things that we can do, then here, let me flip back to this slide here. It really means that we need to think about planning. And that's a big part of what I do in my business. So I certainly plan related to weather, but other events as well. Planning itself is an art. It's not a science. So, I wish I could say, here's a program and just plug things in and it'll tell you what's happening or what's going to happen and exactly what to do. But life is not quite that formulaic yet. So that does mean that, we need to analyze information, but we also need to strategize. And that means maybe thinking about different occurrences and what our reactions would be. Now, there's different types of planning. Planning can be strategic, which usually is about those strategic plans that go out 3, 5, 10 years. Business plans, which are usually down to the line of business, program, or product level. Operational plans are typically the ones that are done with maybe an annual, 6-month, quarterly, monthly, or even weekly mindset as far as day-to-day tasks. And then contingent and business resumption plans, those are two phrases that are actually different and sometimes get interchanged. So contingency planning is about forecasting what you think could happen and then providing some backups for that. I'm going to mute for 1 second to cough. I will tell you one of the side effects of our weather is the pollen. So that's why I muted there. But business resumption is really different than contingent planning. So business resumption is when something actually occurs, what we do to get things moving again. So the more that you do in contingency planning, the better prepared you are for business resumption when it does actually have to occur. So you can see that those plans that I highlighted actually are interrelated, because the more that you're doing this trickle down from the strategic to the day-to-day, you're also analyzing the things that could be affected by weather and climate change. I'm a big fan of creating scenarios for the future. And so 3 ways that we can think of that is best case, worst case, and realistic case. You could do other flavors of this. If you really wanted to get granular, you could be looking at probability as well as impact, and you could have a lot of different factors. You could use sophisticated programs to do this, or you could just do the back of the envelope and you could say, okay, if this kind of weather event occurred, what would be the impact? Well, the best case is that, this, that, and another thing would happen. Worst case, ooh, wow, gloom and doom, right? So you can really do those extremes, and then you can say, okay, the realistic case is that we're going to do some things so that we can actually, recover from that. So that would be those scenarios that we would be thinking about there. All right. And then what we want to think about is how can we take that information and plan for the worst, but hope for the best, right? So I often joke that hope is not a plan. And so we do want to make sure that we're mapping things out, coming out with some documented strategies and sharing it with others. So mapping the processes and flows that would occur. So first of all, having good standard operating procedures in the first place is just a must-have. So if you don't have things documented in terms of how different processes, procedures, operations are done, really should do that just in general. And then, of course, you can review that against how these different events might affect some of those different handoffs and operations. So really also conducting a check and balance, reviewing that frequently, making sure people are aware of it and they're refreshing what those tasks are. And also, I know that we used to talk about having a backup plan or a contingency plan. We really have to have several backup plans these days. So not just a plan B, but plans B, C, D, and E. All right, so a backup for the backup for the backup for the backup, because there can be ripple effects. There can be compounding weather effects at the same time. We can have different types of weather hitting us, back to back as well. So looking at what can go wrong, and that's really looking at the risk event, how to minimize the risk event's impact. So what are the consequences of this? What can be done before something happens? So that's anticipating. And then, of course, what to do when an event actually occurs. And again, that harkens back to the business resumption part of this as well. So take advantage of what you can do in advance. So here I give you some things that hopefully are helpful to you in terms of thinking about some of these advanced protocols that you can take. So have a backup chain of command in the first place. That should be documented, it should be shared, it should be easily accessible to people, and that includes also a call down roster or tree that's very clear, and have backups for that as well. And then having a communication update system. So the more that you have technology in place that's stored, in the cloud, that has its own outside backups, that's going to help you. And then evacuation procedures that are posted both online and in that physical space, in your physical work environments as well. That means that then you should be doing some drills and practicing these things. In addition, thinking about stockpiling emergency items. So there are things where you can have bags or items available to not just your workers, but maybe other important stakeholders. So I would recommend highly, if you haven't read the book, How to Prepare for Climate Change, A Practical Guide to Surviving the Chaos. It's by David Pogue, P-O-G-U-E. He published it in 2021. And if you haven't heard of David Pogue, he's been he's been on a variety of science programs and news outlets for many years. And so he talks about things, for instance, going in a to-go bag, such as water, food, clothes, toiletry, portable radio, flashlight, first aid kit, hand sanitizer, plastic bags, supplies of, maybe even medicines and that kind of thing. So it could be personal items, it could be work items, and you can help guide people to put those things together. Then also have an in case of emergency set of information that again is updated and easily accessible, and that could be for a variety of type of emergencies, not just weather related. Certainly we need to have people who have first aid training. That way, maybe it's, if you have several departments, maybe there's one person in each department that's had that training. Having alternative off-site locations, so maybe renting temporary office space, so you have that as a backup in another location, so it's ready to go. Safety mechanisms where you're protecting the windows or other structures, and definitely any of your electronics. Making sure you're backing up your data. I think we've all learned during the pandemic how important that is in the first place, but definitely important in this context. And the more that we avoid paper, of course, the easier that's going to be. And then really, we have a lot of ways to communicate with people what the status is. Remember, you're going to have not just your workers, but your other stakeholders, your customers and others. So using social media and other ways to use mass texting even, so that you can keep people updated on where things stand, when you expect to be back up and running, and so on. And then having funds set aside in your budgeting process to make sure that you have those for those recovery efforts should you need them. Cross-training your staff so that if people have to cover for others that are either isolated because of the weather and can't get to work, or are not able to otherwise participate and communicate. And then having a review and an adjustment of your insurance. So I know this isn't an insurance session, but obviously if you're not that person, you want to coordinate with your risk management to make sure that's in place. And then strategizing with third-party organizations as well. So again, there are a lot of outside experts. So that means that we have to also communicate effectively. It's not enough to put things in place if they're not communicated very well. So you should create a communication plan. The purpose of such a plan is threefold. You're communicating protocols before something happens, when something happens, and then even after you've resumed business, to kind of reinforce that message as you continue to incrementally get things back together. Now, that means you're looking at what is the very highest priorities and the reasons for changes. Not everybody is going to maybe automatically understand why you're making changes, so you're going to have to make that very clear. Make sure they understand the urgency for making changes and reducing any uncertainty. So a lot of people are going to be stressed. They're going to be nervous. Make sure you address that as well. Stakeholder identification and analysis is also important. Let me mute for 1 second. So thinking about who your stakeholders are, I do whole sessions on helping people figure that out. And then determine what information people need. If you give them too much information at the wrong time, then they're going to tune it out. They're not going to pay attention. They're not going to have it when they need it. So you also want to think about how you time this as well. So the frequency, the depth, and what vehicles you're using as well. And then the responsibility and the timing. So sometimes we push information out to people. Other times we need to pull it in. So also understanding that if you have a corporate communications person, you want to make sure they're involved in all of this as well. So I also want to share with you a graphic here that may be helpful. It just highlights those things that you should be doing before, during, and after resumption. This may be a slide that you may want to bookmark. So this really highlights those key questions that you would cover or considerations. And I'm not going to read everything there. But again, this is sort of a blueprint that triggers a lot of the discussions that you should be having and the key points that should be included. Now, I mentioned how important it is that we don't just include our workers, but we think about our customers, our clients, maybe other partners, other vendors. And so here are the things that we need to make sure we communicate. We need to isolate what is happening and communicate it in the most, upfront ways possible. So this is not a time to try to withhold information. We want to make sure that the people are clear, because what happens is when people don't have clear, accurate information, they start to make assumptions, and you certainly don't want them to make the wrong ones. How it's going to affect them, how you're looking out for them. That's very important if you want to keep those customers in particular. How can they reach you? When will you be back to normal? Making sure that you're updating your website with that information, that you are attentive to social media accounts. You've got people that are going to know what to say and when to say it. Sending emails and texts. Definitely call those important customers directly. Let them know that they are important to you and that you are really keeping them in mind as you're moving your operations back forward. And then update your company voicemail greetings. Make sure that if someone calls into the company, there is actually some recording or some voice or some person that they're hearing, and set that up in advance. And then partner with other companies in your industry. So maybe depending on your physical location, there are other companies around you that may be in different industries, but they're also similarly affected. So there's a lot that you can do to partner with people in that actual locale. Reach out to help those affected customers. Remember, especially if you're in the B2B space, they have their businesses that are being compromised as well. And maybe there are some things that you can do to help them that will certainly ingratiate yourselves to them. And then provide incentives so that they do continue to buy from you. Maybe there are some deals, and maybe you take a short-term loss, but in the long run, that's going to help to keep them as customers as well. So those are some pointers. And, again, I'm always happy to continue this conversation. So I'll turn it over to Matt for now. And at the end, if you have questions, I'm happy to come back and answer them. But Matt Schmidt is going to take us through how technology in particular can help mitigate harm during severe weather events. So Matt, I'll kick it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Michelle. Awesome stuff. Really a stellar list of items to consider and execute. I'm also in Chicago, and it is very hot today. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We'll talk about enterprise resiliency and then move very quickly into severe weather and impact it will have. And since Michelle covered preparation for severe weather events, I'll move very quickly through that portion, but still give you the content, of course. There's some great stuff in there, and it does differentiate a little bit. Then towards the end, we'll go through some of the technologies you can use to help both prepare and mitigate the impact of severe weather events on your businesses. So let's step back and recognize a few things, zoom out, look at this from a recent HBR piece. Resilience is not just operational, but presents a true strategic advantage. It's not difficult to think about the opportunities for organizations that are prepared and the drag on those that are not prepared. So business resilience, operational resilience, all critical to success in business moving forward. What we're hearing from customers across the globe is it's no longer just preparing for the same big Sentinel event, or I should say the one big Sentinel event, although we'll talk about that today. But it's about preparing your organization and building the ability to flex that organization in general, not only for weather events, but for all critical events that happen across time. That's the other big lesson we've learned. Customers tell us we've got multiple events happening concurrently. Some are big, some are small, and they ask, how do I flex my organization to respond appropriately? And as Gartner predicts by 2025, CEOs will mandate a culture of organizational resilience. So as we work with customers across the country, a consensus seems to be it's a journey. Enterprise resilience is a journey to move from a reactive position to a more proactive position. And that increasingly means more time and insight you have, the more options you'll have, and the less expensive those options are going to be. So as we think about any event, business interruptions, avoiding those, potential loss of life is another key one for organizations. Negative PR and how to stay clear of that with crisis communications, supply chain disruption and how that might impact your ability to deliver. All this may impact your market opportunities and how quickly you can move to resolve the matter. So as we think about how to move to that proactive posture, we'd Everbridge think about it as an ongoing process, thinking about how to assess the issues and the potential events that can impact the organization. Identifying where those events can happen, correlating all that, and we'll discuss that today, managing a response, and then analyzing and optimizing your response so that your entire organization becomes stronger coming out of each of these events. So one of the things we've heard is looking beyond the four walls and the types of events that can impact your business. So many times businesses are building plans that are considering what happens if I had an active assailant come into the building, or a utility disruption or a fire, things that happen within my campus infrastructure or within my physical location. But one of the things we can agree on is we need to start looking beyond that. So today we're going to talk about these several events where impact goes beyond your campus location. Think of the civil unrest that can occur in locations around the world. Transportation disruption, thinking past what impacts beyond the four walls of your business and campus location, how that impacts you and your people, and then complicated by a hybrid workforce, people working remotely and in person. So those are a couple of themes we'll talk about as we go through today, but I wanted to paint a picture of what it means to be resilient and then what it means to go through this process. Okay, the last bit I'd like to discuss are the traditional barriers as we think about weather events, but then more broadly about any event that might come and impact your business. And the challenges are, as we think about your people and then the physical locations of your businesses, your corporate campuses, manufacturing sites, fleets of vehicles, obviously your IT infrastructure, and maybe your operational environment. If you're a manufacturer, that's a supply chain. If retail, thousands or tens of thousands of vendors. This expands into your ability to deliver to customers and your online presence. All those elements may play a role. So the barriers really compounded by these are separate teams in your business. So as we think about the challenges we commonly hear, one certainly is siloed teams. So you need a way to think about these events that span multiple parts of your organization. How can you get the whole organization collaborating together to respond to them? Related to this is complex processes. We often find that processes differ by people and team, by location. Some may be complete duplicates in some areas, and some teams may cover some things and not others. So there's an opportunity to bring harmony to that and to even extend those processes and their reach. Lastly, disparate systems. So what we're going to talk a little bit about as we go through today's presentation is how we can create a common all hazards risk picture for all your teams at once. So certainly with the weather-related event, that would easily and likely be one of those spans the entire organization. But again, this can apply to any event that affects and impacts your business operation. Automation. So not only getting the people on your teams working better together, but we'll talk a little bit about technology and how you can really automate around you, your physical teams, your digital systems, to help you respond better with a coordinated response to those types of events. And then, of course, lastly, we'll often find different technology systems in place. How do you integrate those? How do you unify those across your organizations to really provide one platform for everyone to work from? We'll get to that answer in a second. First, this is the section where I likely have a bit of overlap with Michelle, so I'm really going to cruise through these next few slides and then pick up with technology. But on this slide, there is much to say, but the essence is this, and we've already discussed that the reach of risk from severe weather and wildfires goes beyond just the four walls of your business. It's not just, do you receive flooding in your building, for example, or does the weather damage the roof of your building or impact your people directly? But the question is the event going to impact the operations of businesses post-event and then in the surrounding area? And are you going to be able to get back up to speed? And on this slide, you see billions and billions of direct and, more importantly, indirect impact to business revenue each year from severe weather events, exactly what Michelle covered as well. Here's another one I'll breeze through. I'm sure many of you are aware the typical weather seasons are, but it's very handy when you're just not as familiar with other regions in which you may have other facilities located. But you never know, you might be as surprised as I was that Region 10, Iowa, Missouri, Nebraska, Kansas are prone to earthquakes. Not seasonal, I'm pretty sure, though. Again, Michelle covered preparation. Here we look at this very important aspect from a slightly different angle. So give it a read. When you get the deck, one thing you'll want to walk away with now, though, is doing a quarterly review is best practice and really good preparation. But again, Michelle really covered that very well. So we've talked about being proactive. We've talked about how to know early, to know the situation, know what to do, and then know how it went. We talked about coordinated response and the many barriers to all that. Michelle brought us through what's ahead for severe weather, and we saw here statistics on the massive cost involved when these events impact your organization. So what can you do? Let me talk a little bit about how technology can help. And I think the best way to do this is to take you through an example of a severe event and show you how one organization responded and responds to and leverages technology to respond to that event. So the event we've chosen is a wildfire. Wildfires are brought on by the particular regional climate conditions and can literally be ignited during severe weather events. But most importantly, the methods in which you can and will prepare for wildfires and execute response plans for them run very closely parallel with those for which you'll hear a classic weather event response plan. So wildfires provide a very tangible example for us today to see how technology can help. In our example here, we've got a manufacturing organization that has a corporate campus in California, and there's a wildfire that is spreading. You can see that here on the screen. And with technology, they're able to monitor this event in real time and quickly understand what locations and employees might be impacted by the fire, yes, but also the potential expansion of the event where it is likely to expand. And you can see on the right, they're able to literally get eyes on the situation, here tapping local cameras, traffic cameras, etc., to understand from a tangible point of view how the fire has spread. So here we're seeing not only the impact of the fire, but the cameras are providing information on the impact of smoke. What does that look like? And what are the latest updates? In the scenario, we've quickly been able to determine we have just over 100 people who work for us and with us in the impacted area. Within the zone, we have a corporate campus and a couple of manufacturing sites. So in this case, we're putting the security team in the center of our story. They activate the wildfire critical event plan. So really, technology can help extensively here. Getting all those right people, all the right tasks in real time across all the departments. Again, we talked about that cross-department governance structure. So working across all departments on the activation of their plan, giving them tasks, and you can track that in real time, track those responses. Is everybody picking up their steps? Are they being completed on time? All that can be done with technology. Now, based on this plan, the security team decides to evacuate the impacted facilities on the corporate campus. And that seems like a logical response. But we talked about how do we flex the whole operation? How does your business respond? In this example, operations has another manufacturing site that is not in the impacted area, and they decide to expand capacity to that non-impacted site. We also look at things like the supply chain. Supplies planned to arrive to the impacted manufacturing facility obviously will be unable to be delivered, so we can potentially reroute them to the expanded capacity site. Human resources, in this case, the people team, which is also a component of our cross-team effort, can reach out to impacted employees to provide guidance. And even those who are at home, they might not need to tell them, or they might need to tell them, actually, don't come into work today, or provide steps prepared to take to protect themselves and be prepared for a wildfire in this case. They also can, of course, reach out directly to employees who are in the impact zone of the fire to give them different advice and offer assistance directly to them. So we've used some technology with these teams who are often find are mobile, and they may also be a centralized hub, like a GSOC or an operations center. But regardless, your technology should be able to cover all of those. At the same time, you've got multiple teams working. You need ways for those teams to collaborate. And you also need ways to provide critical information to your senior management team. In this case, a dashboard has been pre-built so that as we share all the information and updates, all the teams, we can directly provide this dashboard or situation report up to senior management, empowering them to make better business decisions while the teams are doing their response, and keep an eye on the whole process as it unfolds. In our scenario here, security has evacuated those facilities, and after they've evacuated those facilities, they decide to lock them down. In this case, we're highlighting that digital systems and physical systems can help you here. So this is an automated lockdown where they can automatically lock all doors, secure the site without anyone necessarily on site to do that, reducing the risk to all employees, frankly. And so that sort of hyper automation can help you respond faster and more safely. In this scenario, they're staffing a conference bridge for the security team members, and a separate bridge is set up for the employees. There are many ways for employees to communicate, such as audio bulletin boards and other ongoing communications as well. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it's important to think about what's post-event. So in this example, as the fire is contained near the facilities, the security team is allowed back in to assess the damage, recording the damage directly through the platform. The team is photographing and documenting to make decisions on which buildings in the facility can be opened and which can't be opened. And they determined that a parking structure on the main campus that just cannot be reopened and one of the impacted manufacturing sites also cannot be opened. And again, all of the information can be shared in real time as updates are being provided to senior management team so they can make better business decisions about how they continue to flex the organization. Again, directly through the platform, we can give the okay to reopen the rest of the campus directly to all staff impacted, letting them know they can return to campus. Or we can direct impacted employees to work from home who may work within the impacted facility. Or again, in this case, if the impacted manufacturing facility, we can begin offering them shifts at one of the other facilities as we bring up that other building as well, and roll out employee assistance programs or EAPs. Okay, so we walked through a quick example, but it brings together a number of elements. And the key thing that we see as we think about this idea of assessing and acting on these events, we were alerted to the wildfire and able to monitor the impact of the spread of the wildfire, the smoke, getting both visual and text-based alerting, and again, fast forwarding to those post-event analyses, yet still recognizing the assess stage, this time being the damage. On the locate side, and this is really key, thinking of the risk events that impact the business, being able to quickly understand who or what, who being people, what being other assets like vehicles and buildings, who or what in the potentially impacted areas of the incident, who's within the fire perimeter. Knowing this allows you to use the platform to tailor and flex your organization appropriately. As we mentioned earlier, think about remote employees. Think about travelers who are there to visit the corporate campus. They may also be staying in or near the affected area. And then, of course, responders as they evacuate. In the act phase, we communicate with all the stakeholders. As you can imagine, communications is one of the most important yet biggest challenges as you think about an event like this. Getting out regular updates, we talked about this, Michelle covered it as well, so that people are aware of what's happening. We did an evacuation here, kept management informed, and then of course did our damage assessment. And then after the event is over, and with a wildfire that can last quite a while, all of the information is recorded in the platform. You can leverage all of that information and data, bring it back to your cross-department governance committee, your risk management committee, and have that conversation of, here are the areas needed to improve as we think about that plan for the next type of event that might happen anywhere across the organization, and what were the lessons learned. Build it into your exercises, build it into tabletops, or if you do a live type of exercise, integrate that directly. I thought I would just list a couple of examples of customers that we've worked with and some things that we've done in response to these types of weather events. Walgreens is a long-term Everbridge customer, and through their SOC, their Security Operations Center, which is where they centrally control these matters, during the 2018 hurricane season, and they continue to do this, they would not only do many of the steps we're talking about, but in addition, they would do regular safety and well-being checks on impacted team members who might be at home, not necessarily even working at that time, but at home to make sure they're staying safe. We talked a little bit about supplies. We work with a major pharmaceutical chain across the U.S. They really spend a lot of time monitoring events across the country. In this case, they're looking at the impact of Hurricane Harvey, and that hurricane, as that hurricane emerged, they were quickly able to assess and impact their customers who have to deliver medications to the impacted area. Their regular supply chain wasn't working, of course. So they coordinated an alternate supply chain to fly into those medications, and which was a big win for their customers, but also for their business, both from a reputational standpoint, but also from a financial perspective. And then to wrap up, I list one last coming off of COVID, not necessarily weather related, but given our wildfire example, you see how this one could easily apply. A major bank was sending out notices about COVID symptoms. So again, keeping engaged with staff and respect to people resilience is what we commonly see organizations doing. So with that, I think I'll turn it back over to you, Maria, for a Q&A. If any questions have come through that either Michelle and I can handle.
Well, thank you so much, Michelle and Matt, for a fantastic presentation. Before we have our presenters address some of the questions that have been submitted, I wanted to remind you that we would love your feedback in our webinar survey to help improve our programs. And now for our first question. What technology trends are you seeing in critical event management?
Yeah, sure. I can take that one. There's a lot of technology that can help around critical events. A couple of key things we've heard from customers. First one is really just much better ways of monitoring events that could impact your business. Risk intelligent platforms. Certainly at Everbridge, we have a leading platform that we offer out to customers. But I think the idea of how do you stay on top of monitoring these events and seeing them coming, but also how do you quickly correlate those to your business and then what the impact is. So we're seeing a significant uptick in evaluating these platforms over the traditional, maybe we'll watch the news kind of insights that are available in the market. The other one that is interesting is that we live in an IoT world. And so the question is, how do we tie into the physical and digital systems that are around us and help us respond? So how do we extend that out, right? I gave an example of locking the doors in a facility. But for example, in an enclosed building, how do you quickly reverse the HVAC system, shut the fire doors, and really change the posture of the building without people having to go around and actually do that stuff? They can do it remotely. So that's another trend in business that they're checking out. So that IoT layer and how we bring that into our critical event response. And then the last one I think I'll mention really quick is that many organizations have binders of plans. Michelle was talking about paper and then, getting away from that and getting digital. So I think as many events happen more frequently, many organizations are realizing that digitizing those plans in a way that enables the team to do better collaboration during an event across those departments is another key initiative that companies are taking, right? So how do we get those plans out of paper and into something digital and actionable that everyone can leverage and access? And there's a lot of benefits and transparency and real-time collaboration that occur from that.
Okay. And aside from weather, what are the typical events you see organizations planning for?
So, I think coming out of COVID, companies are perhaps classifying that as a non-repeating type of event, but that's lingering, right? Even if faintly now. So I think security events, active shooter, I think many organizations have an active shooter, active assailant, workplace violence kind of plan. Cybersecurity is another prevalent one. Unfortunately, coming out of last year, cyber attacks, ransomware attacks were up in many companies. And while many ransomware attacks have made headlines this year, perhaps the one that is still most memorable is that Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack. So that's a common one. And then the last thing is just thinking about how all those things overlay each other. I think many organizations will pick their top 5 that they want to focus on. But the takeaway is to think about managing these events that happen all at once, potentially.
Okay. Any tips or advice with conducting training and exercises?
So I'll jump in on that one. So first of all, I think, Matt, you made a great point. I mean, yes, we're talking about weather and climate specifically today, but, everything from having good protective intelligence, looking at natural disasters, technological backup, and even industry specific eccentricities that we need to, maybe have backups for is really important. So training is a big part of this, and certainly reinforcing that. So having simulations, whether it's very sophisticated simulations, whether it's something that you do internally, I'm a big fan of not reinventing the wheel. So there are a lot of vendors that can give you the starting place for some of the drills and some of the protocols, and then you can customize them to your own unique needs. Certainly, looking at how you're coordinating with outside parties such as your local government, your police, the fire departments, the utility companies. And so that means that you're coordinating with them beforehand in anticipation or in contingency planning, and during, as well as after you've resumed as well. So remember, you're not just operating in a vacuum. And then also this aspect of remote employees, we know that that's not a temporary phenomenon anymore. So how are you anticipating drills and executing those with people who are really in their home environment? So now you also should be rolling in some of the considerations in a home as well. And then really, also incorporating things like the supply chain. So we saw, for instance, when we went through COVID, that it wasn't just everything that COVID brought in, but then there were supply chain issues as a result. And then maybe we even have, currently we've got the issues exacerbated through inflation and gas prices and so on from world events. So we can't do these things sort of like in isolation, separate from each other. So looking at, how we're coordinating, backup supplies, availability, resources, and then also even just in terms of technology, thinking about how we can eliminate having people putting themselves potentially in harm's way, right? So even things like drones that can be used many times in surveillance to kind of assess damage or to help to bring information back. And then even debriefing after an event. So I think many times we focus things like training and exercises related to that on just preparatory things. And, we try to anticipate everything. We're not going to be able to do all of them. But we also should be debriefing after we recover from an event, because many times there are a lot of lessons that we could learn, not only from what we went through as a company, but learning from other companies as well. So that's also a reminder that there's a portion of competitive intelligence in this, that we should be looking at companies not just in our own industry or in our own area, but maybe how companies in other areas have handled things as well. And then the last thing I would just mention is that many times we also have investors, whether it's shareholders, stockholders, other parties that we rely on for capital or funding, and they are also looking closely at what are we doing to prepare for these types of events. So it's not just smart for us, but it's smart for the other things that we want to bring to our business as well.
Yeah, great point, Michelle. I think the part about that doing a post-mortem on that, doing the post-event analysis and debriefing is really important too.
Okay. Another similar question. If most of the company is now remote and around the country, how can we choose what crisis to review for plans?
So I can start that one, and then I'll kick it over to you, Matt, for a little bit more meat on that. But as far as remote workers, I think the question there really seems to focus more on, how we can choose what crises that we're planning for. And I think that you do need to understand where people are working from, right? So some people have moved to other states, and sometimes their coworkers aren't fully cognizant of that. But it is important that somebody at the company is keeping an assessment of those things, because while maybe we're in one part of the country where there's tornadoes at a given time, maybe that person is actually off at another part of the country and they may be dealing with no conditions, or they might be dealing with completely different conditions like fires, for instance, that could be occurring simultaneously. So I would say acknowledging where people are coming from, and as well as what those unique conditions are. And then having a remote work policy means incorporating these contingencies into the actual policy itself. So that's sort of my HR take on it. Matt, what do you want to add?
Yeah, I think you covered it pretty well, Michelle. I mean, where you can bring in any sort of technology that fits with people, right? That people are used to using, that work with people, and the ability to use that not just during events. The whole reactive. Think about the reactive and proactive discussion we had earlier, but to be proactive. And really plan for these as we were talking about, but also have those systems in place, the processes, but also allowing the technology to automate aspects for you so that you can respond and scale.
Okay, and one more question. What platforms are most effective for monitoring news and social media around a crisis?
Yeah, I'll start there, Michelle. Maybe you can start with there, but that's a great question, and it's really one thing that needs to be done on many levels, right? Businesses are not only just doing that for their own market awareness using platforms, but also for being proactive. And we were talking about being proactive as a strategic advantage, and using these platforms is really important. Again, it's going to be hard for me to distinguish which of the platforms are going to be used for business intelligence, and then which are going to be used for, say, risk. Everbridge, as I was saying, is definitely a risk intelligence platform that will really give an organization a leg up. There, of course, are other sorts of platforms out there, but that sort of type of platform is going to give an organization a leg up to understand where the risk is coming from and that's coming at them. And then, of course, there's this, if you drift a little bit farther off of that course, you're talking about social platforms that are listening, quote unquote, for things that are happening, either pre-programmed for the locations that an organization finds themselves and gives them alerts for that. So I would say that, again, splitting between the pure social platforms and then the risk intelligence platforms is the way you want to look at it.
Yeah, and let me just add, there are a few other things, and I know we use the word platform. Technically, it's around technology, but keep in mind that there are blogs and websites on crisis management as well. And so, in addition, one of the things I did a while back is I signed up through my city to get alerts, and I get alerts about weather, as well as maybe there are road closures that may not have anything to do with weather issues, and that's really helpful because you can get that text to you automatically. And my understanding is every city has that capability, so you can go out to your city's website and take a look and sign up for emergency notifications. The other thing is, you've probably seen this in some instances, even on Facebook, where people are marking themselves safe in different events, and so you can set that kind of thing up through social media as well, either on a personal or professional basis. But also, just looking at, PR News crisis management, or entrepreneur crisis management, free management library. There's a lot of great websites out there that can also kind of, give you some of this information. So, I do encourage you to seek out those. The one thing that we got to be careful about is that sometimes we can overwhelm ourselves. And because this is information that changes very quickly, that's why I really do emphasize that if you can get tapped into your official governmental notifications in your local area, those types of things, you're not only going to know what's happening more accurately and more timely, but also sometimes that'll help you with some of the cross coordination with other things that are going on around you as well.
All right. Well, that is all the time that we have for questions today. Please join me in thanking Michelle Cousins and Matt Schmidt for their great presentation, as well as our sponsor, Everbridge. If you do have any additional questions or comments, please don't hesitate to click the email us button on the console. Please also visit securitymagazine.com for the archive of this presentation, as well as other information about our upcoming events. We appreciate your time and hope that you have found this webinar to be a valuable experience.